Does the physical world exist, or am I just dreaming? Maybe my brain is plugged into a computer somewhere. In fact, how do I know that I even exist? Maybe I'm a figment of somebody else's imagination. Join me as we ask René Descartes, as he kicks off the Enlightenment and its new way of doing philosophy that branches off from the classical method. Let's talk about René Descartes on epistemology and God. First, we'll just introduce the Enlightenment. Then I'll discuss Descartes' new epistemology, followed by his ontological argument for the existence of God as perfection. Then we'll get into his discussion of God as supreme being and his relationship to creation. Then we'll talk about reason, language, and animals. First, let's just briefly sketch out the history of philosophy. We start out with Thales of Miletus as the first of the pre-Socratics. Later on, we have Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to form the Greek classic philosophy and the spread of Greek culture and philosophy through Hellenism after Alexander the Great. Then we have the birth of Christ, and Hellenism continues through the Roman Empire. Classical philosophy continues, and we have Augustine at the tail end of Hellenism issuing in the medieval period. In the midst of the medieval period, we have Thomas Aquinas, and we also have William of Ockham, who sets the stage for the future Enlightenment. There's also many others in the Middle Ages that we're not going to discuss. At the end of the Middle Ages, at the end of the 1500s, we have René Descartes, who we're talking about in this video. And he really initiates the philosophical aspect of the Enlightenment. He was also a mathematician and a scientist, as we'll see in a second. So the Enlightenment takes a new trajectory, breaking off from the classical tradition of philosophy and doing philosophy in largely different ways. In the Enlightenment, we have a philosophical school of thought called modernism. We'll discuss the nature of that here in a second, and that lasts until the 1800s. In the midst of that, we have John Locke, we have David Hume, we have Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant issues in postmodernism because Immanuel Kant is as radical, or perhaps in some ways even more radical, than Descartes, and he issues in postmodernism. And then in postmodernism, we have Soren Kierkegaard, who's often considered the father of existentialism. Later on, we have Friedrich Nietzsche and Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. By the end of this timeline, and by the end of this course, we will posit the full implications of what happened in the Enlightenment and juxtapose that against the those who continue in a classical tradition, Neo-Aristotelianism, Neo-Thomism, and much of Christian philosophy. We'll juxtapose those opposites and see if much progress has been made or if there's something that needs to be recovered that we've lost. All right, here's the influence of René Descartes in just broad sweeping categories. He was first and foremost a mathematician and introduced analytic or algebraic geometry, as well as many other things. In science, he said that nature can be understood with a comprehensive physics of a few universal laws. This was very influential, thinking that just a few universal laws could explain physics. And this provided a major influence on some of the big scientists that come soon after Descartes, like Isaac Newton, for example, in posing the three laws of thermodynamics and the law of gravity and things like this. Of course, in philosophy, he shifted the foundations of reality, metaphysical realism in the classical tradition, to self, epistemological rationalism. with an emphasis on objectivity. So what does this mean? This means that philosophy so far has been mostly focused on metaphysics, thinking that we first and foremost learn about reality and then afterwards reflect on how we think. But Descartes shifts the emphasis to say that first and foremost we should think about thinking and then think about reality. He also presents a large emphasis on objectivity, where he wants to understand reality as it is in itself, in an objective way, not tainted by human bias or subjectivity. This is hugely influential on the modern scientific method and modernism, and this objectivity gets later rejected by Immanuel Kant, and especially the existentialists like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and later on. Now let's compare and contrast classical and modernist philosophy. Okay, we're going to leave off postmodern philosophy, and at this point we are simplifying Greek ancient philosophy with medieval philosophy and combining them into the term classical philosophy. Oftentimes classical just refers to ancient Greek philosophy, but here we're including medieval philosophy. In terms of philosophical focus, the classicists focused on metaphysics and of course ethics, and in modernity ethics continues to be a big deal, but the focus shifts from metaphysics to epistemology. In terms of metaphysics, the classical philosophers are realists. They say that nature is real and that there can also be a supernatural reality or a reality that is other than just the material and physical world. This is not necessarily even talking about religious supernaturalism. This is just to say that there's something other than physical matter in the universe. Whereas modernity tends to focus largely on naturalism, where a lot of the philosophers, not René Descartes himself, but a lot of the philosophers who come after him, focus on nature or the physical world as all that exists. In terms of epistemology, classical epistemology is going to say that observation and reason are both required as the source and test for knowledge. They interact with each other and both are necessary. Reality is observed prior to reflection on epistemology and how we know. In modernity, we have rationalism of a distinct kind. Modernist rationalism says reason alone is the chief source and test for knowledge. Reality can't be known prior to self-knowledge. But you see, even also within the Enlightenment, we have other people who champion empiricism. This modernist empiricism says that observation is the chief source and test for knowledge. Now, the implications of this are, in the classical philosophy, the ethics and epistemology are based on metaphysics, but in modernity, observation and reason become competing philosophies. And then we have the rise of verificationism, which says that you should not believe something unless it is absolutely 100% provable with logical certainty, either based on rationalism or based on sense observation in empiricism. Skepticism expands in response to this even within the Enlightenment, because if that level of certainty is required for belief, and if that level of certainty is not really possible, then we can't really know anything about reality. So skepticism begins to expand. In ethics, in classical ethics, there's a strong objectivism based on human nature as a metaphysical universal teleology. That is to say that human nature has within itself a built-in sort of standard of what counts as functioning as a good human being. Like a car. A car is designed to function in a certain way. And when it functions in that way, it's good at being a car. But when it breaks down or does something wrong, then it's bad at being a car. So this metaphysical human nature is to say that this is an essence. Human nature is a real thing that is in common with all humans, and that's why it's universal and it's teleological, because within the nature of what it is to be human is a set standard of what it is to be good at being human and bad at being human. So ethics is based on metaphysics and is a universal teleology. This is largely expressed in virtue ethics. But in modernity, we have a weaker objectivism based on universalism, which this deontology puts aside teleology but preserves the universalism. Or, on the other hand, you have a moderate relativism based on teleology, such as consequentialism, that rejects the universalism. So just glance at this overall for a moment here. So in epistemology, we have observation and reason working together. But in modernity, they are divorced and posed as competing philosophies. In ethics, we have universal teleology working together to form one metaphysical essence of human nature. But in modernity, universalism and teleology are divorced and set up as competing philosophies. Now for some major schools of thought. In classical field, there's Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, Scholasticism, Christianized philosophy, and virtue ethics. In modernity, there's rationalism, empiricism, skepticism, humanism, analytic philosophy, verificationism, consequentialism, especially emotivism and utilitarianism, and deontology. Some major thinkers in the classical realm are Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Boethius, Anselm, Avicenna, Averroes, Thomas Aquinas, John Duns Scotus, and Leibniz, and many, many others. In modernity, we have Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, John Locke, George Berkeley, David Hume, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, and so many others. Here's a brief note. The Enlightenment thinkers expressed chronological snobbery when labeling the medieval period Dark Ages. As they rejected old metaphysics, epistemology, and religion, they declared themselves enlightened, as if they were coming out of Plato's cave. Certainly, the medieval period boomed in education, science, art, and philosophy. Do we make progress in philosophy or lose something worth recovering? Let's trace out the rest of the history of philosophy to find out. Now, I'm just painting in broad brush strokes for classical versus modernist philosophy, and even though there is some tension present, some major tension present already between modernity and classical philosophy, that does not necessarily mean that either one of these are completely correct or completely wrong. In fact, it is usually the case that there will be something good that comes out of both of them, and some bad things out of both of them as well. And our task is to use reason to figure out what we should keep, what we should recover, and what we should abandon. Now let's talk about Descartes' new epistemology. René Descartes, who lived in the 16th straddling the 16th and 17th century, was uncertain about the direction philosophy had been going so far. So he wanted to test everything with scrutiny and develop a method later called Cartesian doubt, which is a systematic process of doubting the truth of one's belief. He said he doesn't have to prove prior theories false, he only has to see if they can be doubted. In adopting this method, he assumes, and does not defend, a philosophy called verificationism. Verificationism is the philosophy that you should only believe what you can prove with absolute certainty. This philosophy is debatable and therefore can be doubted. If Cartesian doubt says anything that can be doubted can't be the foundation of truth, and the merits of Cartesian doubt can be doubted, then Cartesian doubt is self-defeating. Let me read that again for emphasis. If Cartesian doubt says that anything that can be doubted can't be the foundation of truth, and the merits of Cartesian doubt can be doubted, then Cartesian doubt is self-defeating. Likewise, if verificationism is a philosophy that says you shouldn't believe anything unless it is proven, then we must prove verificationism before believing it, and it is doubtful whether that is possible. Therefore, verificationism is self-defeating. Nevertheless, it is worth explaining Cartesian doubt to see its influence on later verificationism, skepticism, phenomenology in Immanuel Kant, nihilism, pluralism, and most other modern philosophies. Alright, now let's explain Cartesian doubt as we walk through Descartes' argument. Have you ever been mistaken about what you thought you saw? Have you ever seen an optical illusion? Since senses can be doubted, they can't be the foundation of knowledge, and neither can natural sciences, which study through the senses. Can you doubt math? Perhaps not, but then again, maybe I'm deceived by an all-powerful entity, like God, into believing in these mathematical principles and the existence of the physical world. Since we say that God is good and deception is not good, let us postpone the question of God. Instead, we may wonder whether an evil demon, or malicious demon, as Descartes says, is deceiving me. Or maybe my brain is plugged into a computer, or I'm really a robot but don't know it. If the world could be a deception, then what can I be certain about? Can I doubt that doubting is going on? No. So there must be a doubter, namely me. This proof that there is a doubter, namely that I exist, has been summarized by saying, I think, therefore I am. Or in Latin, cogito ergo sum. That's an important phrase. Descartes never actually says this, but it's a famous summary of his idea. Descartes has one piece of knowledge he knows is certain. Now he can use deductive reasoning to figure out what else must be true based on this one fact, which we will do in a moment. Here's a few basic criticisms of Cartesian doubt. First, Cartesian doubt and verificationism are self-defeating. We've already mentioned that. Also, it gives a disregard of a vast number of self-evident propositions. For example, the 3 laws of logic, math, causality, and all sorts of other principles. Skepticism about senses is only possible if sense realism is true. So the doubt already is only possible because there is an assumption or there is a reality that can be doubted. Doubt functions as a disproof, even if Descartes claims otherwise, right? So Descartes explicitly says that he is not proving that the world does not exist. He is not trying to disprove so many other philosophies. He is just saying that if I can doubt them, they are not absolutely certain. But the way this ends up functioning, the way that Descartes ends up using it, and certainly the people who follow Descartes later, end up using this Cartesian doubt to say, if I can doubt it, then that's good enough as a proof that it is not an absolute truth. Another criticism is one can only reflect back on the existence of the knower and become self-conscious after one has encountered reality. That's part of why animals can't think, I think, therefore I am, because they are incapable of self-reflection, even though they still encounter reality. So self-reflection can only happen after sensation and not before it. Sensation of reality, of something other. Another criticism, Descartes' method never succeeds in proving anything other than his own existence, or solipsism. Solipsism says We will discuss solipsism here in a minute, but this is a wide criticism that Descartes' method never actually succeeds in proving anything, or if it does, he only proves his own existence, and not any of the following proofs that we are about to discuss. This is Descartes' ontological argument. So his first premise is that I exist, all right? So this is just a carrying on of the argument from the previous section. Now what can be proven next? I seem to sense the exterior world, but is it real or imagination? Something cannot come from nothing. That's just a fundamental principle. So where do these sensations come from? Descartes is attempting to avoid solipsism, the theory that the self is all that can be known to exist. What kinds of things are impossible for me to imagine? I can imagine the world simply from my knowledge of myself. I can imagine the world simply from my knowledge of myself. I can imagine a horse and a rhinoceros to invent a unicorn. Prior to this, I can also think of my own body and different shapes to imagine a horse. So I haven't proven anything beyond my own existence. Everything that I think is the world is really just an extension of what I know of myself. The only way to prove something other than myself is to see if I have any ideas that I could not have created or invented. Since something cannot come from nothing, and more cannot come from less, I need to think of an idea bigger or more perfect than anything I find in myself. Maybe this is God, but then again, maybe I create God by imagining a bigger, better, more ideal version of myself. This is the first objection to this argument. I imagine my own improvement because I am aware of degrees, which implies a perfect standard by which I measure these degrees. I seek perfection, but never obtain it. Perfection is more than is within me, and more cannot come from less, just as something cannot come from nothing. Therefore, this perfection exists outside of me, and I could not have invented it. And this we call God, the sum of all perfections, being, true, unity, or one, and good. Here's a summary of Descartes' ontological argument. Something cannot come from nothing, which is to say nothing comes from nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. This is just a fundamental universally assumed principle. The perfect has something imperfect doesn't. Therefore, perfect, which is to say God, is not caused by the imperfect, me. The central claim there, number 2, is the most important one, that perfect has something that imperfect doesn't. Here's objection 2. If you are imperfect, you can't fully comprehend perfect. So perfect was never in your mind in the first place. Here's Descartes' response. First, imperfect assumes perfect. I can't be aware of imperfect without already knowing perfect. Second, I grant that I don't comprehend perfect perfectly, but that does not mean I don't know it exists. I don't understand everything about myself, but even saying I don't understand everything about myself assumes there is a myself. So Descartes' ontological argument borrows the definition of God from Anselm, who said that God is that than which a greater cannot be thought, or the greatest thing imaginable, and he supplements his argument with Aquinas' cosmological argument from degrees, which says if there are degrees of comparison, there must be a maximum standard by which we measure those degrees. He combines these two ideas in order to conclude that I cannot even think of perfection, the greatest thing imaginable, unless it exists, because my thought of perfection can only be understood as the effect of perfection and not a cause of perfection, as if I were to have created it. based on the universally accepted premise that nothing comes from nothing. That's just a self-evident proposition, that nothing comes from nothing. But how can perfection be the same thing as God? God is a person, and perfect is not. It's just an abstract concept, right? Perfection in Descartes' argument is not merely moral perfection, but the maximum standard in every category of being. Here's the 4 basic transcendentals of being, which is to say, being, or existence, truth, unity, and goodness. As the source of being, this perfection must exist as being. As perfect unity, these 4 qualities must be united. As perfect goodness, this thing must be honest, loving, forgiving, and just. As the source and standard of truth, it must necessarily be true. Now let's continue this line of thought. What is his next argument in this line? So his first proof was that he exists. I exist. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. His second was that God exists, which is an ontological argument supplemented by the cosmological argument from degree. Now, can these be used to prove the existence of the physical world or of other people? Here's the argument, simplified that is, from Descartes. First, it is undeniable that we have sensations. Second, therefore, they are either real, we imagine them, or God is deceiving us. These are the 3 options. We can't always control or choose our sensations, so they can't come from us. If sensation came from God, God would be a deceiver. God is perfect, see the previous proof, and can't be a deceiver. Therefore, the physical world is objectively real. Descartes explains other things about human existence as well, and about this nature, this physical world. He says our senses don't tell us about objects as they are in themselves, but only about what is beneficial or harmful to us. So we don't actually have direct access to the thing itself. We only have a limited access through our senses, and our senses only determine how something is beneficial or harmful to us. All right, this is a rejection of classical immediate sense realism, which says the senses give direct awareness of reality. This later influences Immanuel Kant's phenomenology and anti-realism and eventually postmodernism. If you want to see that influence teased out, go watch my videos on Immanuel Kant and later postmodernism. He also says that space is infinite. He also posits the conservation of mass and energy, which is to say the quantity of motion is constant, which this is a claim that is a predecessor to the first law of thermodynamics later developed by Isaac Newton. He also says that different kinds of matter are caused by different kinds of motion. Think about the history of this kind of idea. The atomist pre-Socratics around 400 BC said that reality was created of indivisible multitude of particles, some fundamental particles, and there were a multitude of them, and they were indivisible. All right, this is where we get the word atom from, 2,400 years ago. Then you have René Descartes, who says that it is motion, that all matter is the same, but some sort of difference in motion at some small level causes things to act in different ways and be different kinds of matter. Later we get the periodic table of elements, which says that there's 118 fundamental elements or kinds of atom. And then later you get string theory, because in an atom, the different atoms, the 118 different atoms on the periodic table of element are all composed of the same subatomic particles, such as protons, neutrons, and electrons. But what are those made of? What are subatomic particles made of? Well, string theory later says that everything in the universe is made of these strings that vibrate at different frequencies. And whatever frequency they vibrate at determines whether they will be a proton, a neutron, a photon, an electron, or something else. So that everything is strings vibrating with different kinds of motion, similar to what Descartes said. Of course, it's very much still a theory. Descartes also introduces substance dualism, which is to say that human nature is two essences, mind and body. The influence of this is that after the Enlightenment, it is nearly impossible for us to think of soul without thinking of it as a sort of ghost inside a shell. You are your soul, and you have a body. This is almost universally assumed at a cultural level because of the major influence of Descartes, if someone posits the existence of the soul at all. However, the classical view, represented by Aristotle and Aquinas here, said that the soul was the form of the material body, which meant that they were an inseparable whole, that human nature was a single substance, not two substances. This is to say, you are your soul and you are your body, a whole composed of both. You are the composite substance, one substance composed of these two aspects. It's like book is to paper. A book is made of paper, but it is something more and different than a mere pile of paper and ink. A book is an intelligible whole that cannot be separated from paper. But it is also not merely paper. It is something more. Let's talk about humanity versus animals. All right, continuing on with human nature, Descartes asks the age-old question, what separates humans from animals? At this point in history, he can now ask, what separates humans from machines or robots as well? He agrees with the classicists, for once, in saying that reason distinguishes us from animals and machines. How does he know? What is a good piece of evidence displaying human rationality? He says the main thing that separates humans from animals or machines is reason. And this is evident by the infinite versatility of linguistic expression. What does that mean? That means humans can rearrange signs and sounds to create unique sentences and meaning. There is no limit to this versatility. This also allows language to grow into new languages or translate other languages. Human bodies are nothing but complex machines, is what Descartes says, right? We are a duality of two substances, and one of our substances, namely our bodies, they're nothing but complex machines, and they're the same as a machine, and the same as an animal. But animals do not have that second substance of mind, not rationality. Descartes imagines we might one day build machines equally complex that mimic human bodies and actions by following some kind of programming. But robots can't be truly creative in their use of language or anything else. At any given time, a human, you, can utter a sentence that has never been said before. Animals and machines only follow a set intuition or programming. They may rearrange these to some extent, but they are forever limited by their stimulus response programming. Let's do the write-up on Descartes on epistemology and God. Go back and review the criticisms of Cartesian doubt. Do you think they are reasonable? Do you think Descartes' ontological argument is compelling? What do you think the soul is? Do you think there is a categorical difference between humans, animals, and robots? Why?